You're listening to The Weekend Take. And now your host, Sean Schaefer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of The Weekend Take. Joining me this week is writer, director, producer, entertainment attorney, and columnist for Script Magazine, Christopher Schiller, who's been on our show a couple of times now previously. Chris, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I've got my own little sequels going here.
Yeah, and that's very much in theme with today's discussion, where we're going to be talking about the current state of the film industry and this kind of love of sequels, for better or for worse, that studios seem to have. And we're going to kind of get into what I call the good, the iffy, and the ugly when it comes to sequels in 2019, and how just this small sample size looks at what seems to be a more problematic trend. But is it one that studios are learning anything from? I guess we're going to find out. Chris, I guess, well, just as a good icebreaker question, if you had to look at your favorite sequel or threequel, what would it be? Do you have a favorite sequel that you prefer over the original?
Oh, that's a great question. You should have asked that before we got started so I could have thought about it for a while. I do like to watch a lot of series of films. So everything from way back when with the Planet of the Apes series of films, the Star Wars movies, even the movies that are really bad, like Ator the Barbarian had several, actually use the same footage from a lot of the films to make their sequels. I really enjoy watching the variations on how you go about getting a sequel made and just what you bring back to the table and what you try and put out there as a new second course. It's always fascinating. Even the bad ones have something to talk about, so which is good.
Well, for me, my stock kind of all-time answer is, of course, I think I prefer Empire Strikes Back over A New Hope. More contemporary example, which is good because we're going to discuss it in this topical discussion, is John Wick 3. Each of the John Wicks I have liked more than the previous ones. I think I saw John Wick, actually I saw them out of order. I saw John Wick 2 with a friend of mine first, who told me, no, you don't need to know anything about the first one, except, they killed his dog, and that's all you need to know. And so I saw John Wick 2 first, and I was like, wow, this is really good. And then down the road, I went back and on Blu-ray watched the first John Wick, and I'm like, yeah, this is a good start to the franchise, but seeing where it's gone, like, that's much better. And then I went to theaters on 2 separate occasions to see John Wick 3, and I felt that was way better than 2 or 1. So
yeah, I feel like I'm missing out on that one because my first exposure was John Wick 1, and I never got past the scene where they killed his dog. So I stopped watching it at that point. And now with John Wick 3 and everything that was talked about and how good that particularly came across, it ended up that I regret it and probably will have to go back and watch John Wick 1 past the dog scene and see the rest of it so I can catch up.
It's certainly a franchise worth checking out. What do you feel like discussing first? The good, the iffy, or the ugly?
I want to go with the Godzilla. I kind of feel like it's a different style of sequel. On one hand, it's a remake of a property that is long-lived and never was given much money to work on. So the original Godzillas were extremely cheaply put together, but they had an endearing quality to them. The latest Godzilla King of Monsters did not perform well, but that's kind of what it's supposed to do if it's going to be a good Godzilla movie, if you follow my line.
I do, but so you were just talking about how the studios didn't give a lot of money to the early Godzilla films. These films, they gave a lot of money to make them, and they just did not see those returns. So to put it into context, the trilogy of movies that the studio considers a trilogy there was a Godzilla film that had come out prior to Kong Skull Island. Mm-hmm. That at the box office had made $200 million domestically. Then Kong Skull Island comes out, which then made $168 million domestically. And these were all supposed to be setting one another up as part of this trilogy, culminating in Godzilla King of Monsters, which then at the box office just collapsed kind of upon itself and made only $110 million. Now, I would love to put anything out that made $110 million. But when you're talking about the size of the budgets that they're spending on these films, that to me, I consider, part of the ugly, because the budgets were still very sizable. They're all 9-digit budgets at least.
Well, what are the aspects of how the studios have approached these large IP blockbuster approaches to sequels when they're planned sequels? Is they lay out the budget ahead of making even the first film. And so they know how much they want to throw at each one of these films if they rise to a certain expected return. So it's very planned out that even if they're not hitting the numbers they want, they had figured out that they could make money over the long term of all the films if they reach a certain return level. And usually, when you see a movie trilogy like the Godzilla, they must have been pretty conservative as to the numbers they needed to hit to be able to pay off what they were paying. So there's a lot of things that get into the structure of these films. And you know how me and Hollywood accounting see eye to eye on everything. Sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they don't even recognize how wrong they've gotten it before they move on. That's just the way that they're able to convince the corporates who own the studios nowadays to invest.
Okay, so in what world do some studio accountants say, you know what, this was so appalling, no sequel? And then other studio accountants are like, you know what, I know we keep just losing money, but let's just keep making them, because there's one really good example we're going to talk about in a second. But in keeping with that kind of idea of trilogies and, okay, well, the first one does well, you greenlit 2 and 3. Here's a trilogy that we're going to talk about, the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
This was a trilogy of films that was on unstable footing from the get-go, because if you look, yes, DreamWorks Animation created these 3 films, but a different studio had to actually go out and distribute it, because each one made a questionable amount, yes, a profit in the end of versus its budget, but it was always just in that gray area of uncertainty of, are we going to greenlight a sequel and who's going to put it out?
Yeah, well, I mean, the backstory of a lot of these corporate sequel thinking does have to weigh all those aspects in mind. Sometimes you have the distribution split is different for the second and third films. So you may have someone who really needs the second film to be released for them to see any kind of return on investment, because they were the minimal payback from the first film that they were expecting everything in the second and third films. So they are going to be much more gung-ho to release the second and third, even if they don't do well, because at least they're making the money for the second and third films, as opposed to the people who took all the profits from the first. So it's not just a single profitable dollar figure that has to be accounted for as to when you get the green light, because it's somebody else who may be saying something.
But in the case of How to Train Your Dragon, so DreamWorks went out and they released the first one, and that one did very well, $217 million domestic. The second film, it was unsure about what was going to happen, even with, yes, it had gotten greenlit, but what was going to be the risk reward. And 20th Century Fox ended up being listed in the end as a distributor for the second film, which took in $177 million. So that's about, $40 million less than the first film.
Mm-hmm.
The third film goes out and takes in $160 million or $161 million. So it's the second made less than the first, the third made less than the second. I guess the silver lining in that is, and it is sometimes the case, is foreign gross, because foreign gross really saved the third film's hide, because in the end, the third film did make more on a worldwide scale than even the first one did. Not as much as the second, but more than the first film did. So a strange franchise, but again, with diminishing returns in the domestic market.
Yeah. And you always have to consider the international market to some degree. It seems like Hollywood often ignores the international market, but there are films and film franchises that thrived on the international market for their mainstay. They didn't really care what they got domestically. They were making the film because they can make so much money overseas.
Yeah.
It's a mindset that'll keep a company in business. And the whole idea of different distributors being able to swap over and try and alter how they're making their money from sequel to sequel to sequel, that goes back a long way. I mean, just look at the franchise of James Bond. There are 20 films. It was one of those franchises where so many different hands and so many different distributors had some type of touch to it, that the series survived and thrived through all of that, as opposed to because of all of that. It's an interesting conundrum. It proves the point that most producers don't really understand what they're doing. They're just stumbling along and find something that kind of works, and they kind of follow it as far as they can.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.
Yeah, franchises are tough because there's going to be, especially if you string it out over a number of films, there's going to be ebb and flow. You hope for a constant incline in your box office take, but you just hope to not have that decline. And if you do have that decline, you should see the writing on the wall and wrap it up. One of the projects that's on my list here that's kind of more in the iffy range, talking about the Fast and Furious franchise, which is now coming up on its 9th film coming up, I believe, in 2020 or 2021.
Yeah, depending on how you count them.
They kind of took a spin-off and they focused on 2 particular characters, Hobbs and Shaw, and they put out that film. And that's looking specifically at The Rock and Jason Statham. So it's not the normal crew of, Vin Diesel and previously, before he passed, Paul Walker, Michelle Rodriguez, and everyone. You're looking at just these 2 characters. But just like Bumblebee in 2019 as well, which kind of existed outside of the primary Transformers franchise, you still consider it part of that universe, and therefore, like, you have to make these comparisons at the box office. So in the case of Hobbs and Shaw, Hobbs and Shaw took in a respectable $173 million at the box office, but still a far cry of $50 million plus from the last installment of the franchise proper, which was Fate of the Furious, which took in $226 million domestically. So when you're looking at franchises, like, I don't think that difference would by any means stop them from continuing the franchise. Obviously not. Fast and the Furious 9 comes out, like I said, in about a year or so. But you think this is one of those cases where it's like, okay, well, like Solo, I think we're going to stop. We're not going to venture off into this spin-off territory anymore.
It gets to that kind of decision making where you decide just how much of a risk can we take with our franchise. If you try to do something and the built-in audience dislikes it more than you anticipated, you kind of have to revert back and say, can we save this, or did we step on our toes? I think the international box office for the Fast and Furious franchise films will save it from oblivion. I think it will continue on past 9 with the continuation, and somebody will figure out a way of bringing in new blood and taking different direction with who's doing what, and get a spinoff that works. I think that's a kind of franchise that's got some backing because the international market says, we don't care who's driving the cars, we want to see them blow up. But that's kind of one of those things where it really depends on the audience's resilience to come back after a failure. And that varies from franchise to franchise. That's always the conundrum with these franchise films.
Some of these franchises, yes, maybe it makes less, but it's still a profit because they cost so little to make. You look at the Annabelle trilogy, which, is a spin-off of another franchise, spin-off of the Conjuring universe. The first Annabelle, when it came out, did about $84 million domestic. The second one took a nice spike and went up to $102 million domestic. And then this latest one, which came out this year, dropped all the way to $74 million. Now, that would be a problem for a studio, except these films only cost them $10, $12 million to make. So It's like, yeah, sure, we made $30 million less, but we're just going to keep churning them out because it only costs us 10 or 12 million to make. We're still profiting,
Yeah.
$40 million per film after marketing and everything else is all said and done. And eventually they will see the writing on the wall, maybe the way that the Paranormal Activity and Saw franchises did, because those just kept on going and going and going. And eventually, like, it was a diminishing return. And they said, okay, we're going to take a break and that'll be the end of it. But really, it's just a hiatus because both franchises are making a return in 2020. So,
yeah. I got two comments. The first comment is when you have a cheap film, relatively cheap, and you make a lot of money but not as much as you used to make with the previous films, you're lighting your cigars with hundreds instead of $1,000 bills. I mean, there's slight difference. So you have to make accommodations to that, but you're still making a ton of money. You also have to look at the smart producers out there like Disney that says if we expose this property too long, we'll burn people out on it. But we can put it in a vault and then take it out. And Disney has this scheme that, you have a brand new audience every 7 years because people come of age. Their target market comes of age every 7 years. So the old movies come out every 7 years, and that way they can refresh it. It stays out for a little bit and then goes away. And people still have that nostalgic remembrance about it. Finding that where that level of, okay, we're too exposed, we need to hold back for a while. Sometimes producers miss it. Sometimes producers try and milk it forever. Sometimes producers have figured out a way of twisting it and taking it to a new realm when it starts to burn out and says, okay, we're going to head off to the left this time. It's just a matter of figuring out where your audience is and trying to stay just that one step ahead of them.
And so now I want to look at two franchises in particular that had major missteps in 2019 with sequels that were released. One of them, the studio looked at and said, okay, we're going to stop, but not really. We're going to repackage it, wrap it up, make it a new present. And that franchise is looking at now Disney's ownership over Fox and therefore over the X-Men franchise. Because this year, Fox put out Dark Phoenix, which was problematic from the get-go during production, reshoots galore. Like, they couldn't find their story, much like their New Mutants film, which I honestly don't think will ever see the light of day. And it made $65 million versus the previous film, which was Apocalypse, which took in $155 million. Now you're not just talking about, oh, it's a $20 million hit. Oh, it's a $30 million hit on a film that cost $10 million, $12 million. Now you're talking about a near $100 million hit on a film that cost over $100 million to make.
Yeah.
This is the franchise that if I'm Disney, and they are doing it, I'm just pulling the plug and then I'm going to wait a little bit and then I'm going to turn it on and see if it works again.
Right.
But with all new people in place.
That's not only in front of the camera for the different kind of story, but also behind the scenes to see if somebody with fresh ideas can come up with a new take on something that was crashed and burned with the last people involved.
Right.
One thing that is driving a lot of this is creating new ideas with new stories is a crapshoot. You never know whether it's a great idea and you love it because it's good, or you just love it because it's not something you've heard before, and whether anybody else will like it, especially the audience that you're making it for. Or do you buy an IP and try and make a movie out of it and try and make a franchise out of it so that you can not have to go out and find a new IP to purchase and try and start the whole project over again? So you've got an IP that's kind of dwindling. It's not necessarily bringing in as much as you would like, but it's easier to keep that one out there than to go and find a new one, pay what you would pay to get a new IP on the board, and see if you can start the whole process over again. It's a much more daunting task to go out and seek new material than to keep pushing stuff that's not quite working, but it's not yet dead.
Well, and that brings me to the second franchise that I was discussing that I think needs to be put to rest unless something can be done, and that's the Terminator franchise. After Judgment Day, which made $207 million domestically when it came out, and you're talking about over 20 years ago, each film since then, chronologically, has made less than the one before it. So looking down the list, you have Terminator 3, which made less than Judgment Day, and then Salvation, which made less than that, and then Genesis, which made less than that, and now Terminator Dark Fate, which is going to be the lowest entrant in the franchise. Yeah, I mean, this franchise either needs, like the X-Men, a complete retooling, which they thought they did with Salvation, or at least they thought they were going to do with Salvation, and it didn't work. Or they just need to let it lie. But like you said, it's so much easier to parade out an old IP that people are at least familiar with and know that, yes, I'm going to take a hit, but it won't be as much as if I took a chance on this other IP that I'd have to put $80 million into to make happen for it to make $10 million at the box office. I'll take Dark Fate making $60 million domestically and losing me $20 million than this sci-fi action film X that I have to put $80 million in, and I'm going to be left losing, $70 million on or $80 million on.
It's a difficult decision, and you know that producers are constantly on front burner trying to say, I've got to produce something, I've got to get something out there, I've got to make my mark in the industry, because job positions change constantly, and you're only in your job for as long as you keep making hits, and you can't make a hit unless you're producing movies. And to be able to put movies out on the time scale that you're out there, you're got to put something out on schedule. So sometimes you get wrapped up in that and you say, well, let's go ahead and put out another Rambo. The guy hasn't died yet, so we can keep making movies with him.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.
That actually segues really nicely into, we got to keep on schedule. We struck gold with the first one, got to strike while the iron's hot, put out a sequel, and this year in particular, that has just failed on so many occasions. Now I'm going to run down a quick little list just so the listeners can get an idea of what I'm talking about, and then you and I will kind of discuss what exactly that means. Like, was it really meant to be one and done? Is it immediate onset franchise fatigue? Whatever. Looking at a few of these examples, we'll start off small. So 47 Meters Down came out and was a surprise, $44 million. The sequel comes out, $22 million. So half as much. Continuing on the list, you have something, okay, well, maybe that's not everyone's cup of tea. How about a family film? Everyone loves dogs, so there's A Dog's Purpose, very popular book series. So Dog's Purpose comes out. Everyone loves it, $64 million. Hey, it's been 2 years. Let's release a sequel. A Dog's Journey comes out, $22 million. So there's $42 million less. So 47 Meters makes 50% of what the first one did. Dog's Journey makes 33% of what the previous one did. Okay, how about the horror film genre? So Happy Death Day, when it came out, $55 million at the box office. Let's release Happy Death Day to You, $28 million. So 50% decline from the first film. In fact, Happy Death Day to You's total run made about what Happy Death Day made its opening weekend. Continuing on this list, Angry Birds, very popular mobile game. Let's make a movie of it. We struck while the iron was hot. The movie comes out, $107 million at the box office. Great. It's been 2 years. Let's make a sequel. Angry Birds 2 comes out this year, $41 million. So a 60% drop from the first film.
Yep.
How about something within a universe that everyone knows? Maybe people don't know Angry Birds, but everyone loves Legos, and the Lego movies are funny and they're witty. So Lego Movie comes out and it's a smash hit. Launches its own little universe that includes, the Lego Batman movie and everything. And it comes out $257 million. Huge box office success for the studio. Okay, so it's been a couple of years. We did Lego Batman and Lego Ninjago, which Lego Ninjago was a complete failure because it just didn't strike with audiences. But Lego Movie 2, it's our favorite characters all back together again. This has to be a success. Negative. Lego Movie 2 does $105 million. So it ends up doing about 40% of what the original film did. You look at another example, you look at another CGI animated film, The Secret Life of Pets from Illumination. Everyone knows Illumination for the Minions and Despicable Me. So Secret Life of Pets comes out. Wouldn't it be funny to know what your pets are thinking and what shenanigans they get into while you're gone? Great concept for a family comedy. hits the ground running, makes $368 million at the box office. Huge success for Illumination. It's been 2 years, got to make a sequel. Secret Life of Pets 2 comes out, $158 million. So it's another 60% drop. One more here to kind of staying in the vein, taking a character from Disney and giving it almost the kind of like what would eventually be the Wicked treatment if Wicked ever comes out. But you look at Maleficent. So Maleficent, Disney decided, well, we're not going to do Disney princess movies. Let's do our own Disney villain movie. We're going to look at Maleficent. And Maleficent comes out, $241 million at the box office domestically. It's a big hit. It didn't need the first film, in my opinion. It certainly didn't need a sequel. But again, money talks. Disney's just playing with house money at this point. So they put out Maleficent 2 this year. And up to this point in its release, which has been out for, I believe, about just under 40 days, is at $109 million. And at this point, the first Maleficent was at $214 million. So again, here you're looking at another over 60% decline from the first film. And I guess the most hyped example being the It franchise. Everyone talks about It. It Chapter 1. Oh, the gore, it's so scary, it's dark, it's creepy. It Chapter 1 comes out, Stephen King adaptation, a remake of the miniseries. It Chapter 1 comes out, huge success for the studio, $327 million. They put so much marketing into It Chapter 2, it couldn't possibly fail. Everyone's got all this steam behind them. We've got a stellar A-list cast playing the adult versions of these kids. Can't fail. It Chapter 2 ends its run at $211 million. So a 33% drop from It Chapter 1. So despite all the hype, despite everything else, one of the biggest examples of just a film that underperforms from the original. So now, kind of looking at this list of films I've just kind of rattled off, which I apologize to the listeners if they couldn't keep up. What is this saying? Are these films that, I know It Chapter 2 had to come out because that's the way it was structured. But looking at the rest of these, like, did these films need sequels? Should they have taken more time? If they took more time, would they lose their audience? Like, what's the studio thinking? What's the thought process? Obviously, I don't think any of these get a third film. I don't think any of them become a trilogy. But what's your take on that, Chris? Like, why this?
There's certain mindset behind the people who make decisions to make to greenlight these films. And it comes from a lot of things, least of which is, will the sequel be good and well received? All the other aspects are, you look at how much money was spent on the production of the first film and the percentage of profit made on that first film. And then you make a calculation saying, if we spend a fraction more on the budget of the second film, just enough to cover the usual bump up in salaries and expanding the storyline just a bit, will we be able to live underneath the low bar that we're expecting as the bottom of the second film, even if it fails? And if you have a positive answer to that question, and you have to keep pushing out product in your studio, then it's a pretty easy green light to get, because say the first film made 700% of its budget back in return, so it definitely was profitable. And the second film's budget will not be 700% more than the first one cost to make. So you have to consider, is half or 30% of the profit that we made in the last film going to impact the amount of profit we'll make if we make a second one? Because we're pretty much guaranteed we'll make profit if the price point of the production is X. And as long as you control the purse strings, you know the price point of the production is not going to go above X. And you know you've got pretty much a guaranteed profit. It just won't be as big as the first one. Financially, that's a good choice, where you don't have to have so many unanswered questions in the mix. That's one of those things where you can't tell an unknown is going to hit. But when you have something that does hit, knowing the second one will not hit as much, But if you can make the calculations and make it a safe bet, you're going to be golden in the studio. You're going to have your job is going to rise, even if the second film does not make as much money from the outward appearance. You can guarantee, much more so than you could even in the first film, this one's going to make us profit. And I can give you a number as to where that profit will be. And profit's profit. So if you can show your shareholders, yeah, we're putting out that second film, we're expecting this kind of profit from it. If we're surprised, that's great. If we're not surprised, if it stays above this level, we're still going to be good, and we can move on to the next one with money in our pockets. So that's how it gets those films on a schedule, especially those that are released on a schedule. You know that somebody is making those calculations. Somebody is saying, this is going to be a tidy profit. It may not be the best profit, but it will be a tidy profit that we can count on, as opposed to the high-risk films of going with something unique.
But now that's looking at it from the studio point of view.
Yeah.
Looking at it from a moviegoer point of view, if these originals were so successful, why are these sequels underperforming the originals by such a large scale?
Well, you can look at it from several different points of view, and the one that I would like to focus on is the creative one, which is some of these movies. Oh, that's a great idea. Why don't we have a movie about it? That would be fabulous. I got to see that movie. Well, you've seen that movie. You don't want to see it again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, several of these franchises that you've just named in this whole list of the second one was precipitously worse than the first is because the second one wasn't doing anything much different than the first was. That's not going to drive people into the sequels. One of the things that really drives the issue about sequelitis and how it is a diminishing return is that it's far too often that the people who are making the second and third and fourth movie in the series are depending upon everyone who saw the first movie to be able to come to the second movie and bring their friends. But that's not how the audience works. The first movie got so popular because people who weren't even interested in the concept saw that it was going to be something interesting or something that they'd want to try out. So the second movie, if it loses the intrigue from the outside, saying, I would like to see the second movie before I've seen the first, like you did with one film you mentioned earlier. If the second film has that intrigue to draw a new audience to it, you're going to continue the franchise and you're going to have a level amount of money, and you're going to have good films that continue to bring new people to the show. The cure for sequelitis is to bring something new. It's like if you keep giving somebody penicillin or antibiotics, eventually they'll get used to them, and you'll have to keep bringing more and more antibiotics to try and knock it out. Sequelitis has to be cured by bringing something new to the table.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.
And speaking of the idea of sequelitis or trying to bring something new to the table or intrigue that audience from the outside, a couple other of these ugly examples are a bit of that, looking at the Men in Black franchise. So it's been some time since Men in Black 3 came out, and somebody somewhere in the studio was like, hey, you know what? We haven't done in a while. We haven't done a Men in Black in a while. Give Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith a call. Oh, they're not interested. They're not available. Okay. Well, we'll get some people and we'll walk them out there. It's new. It's a new shiny toy. And the audiences weren't buying it because I think they wanted Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. Even Men in Black 3, had Josh Brolin and I can't remember who the other actor was in Men in Black 3. So Men in Black 4 comes out and does $80 million versus Men in Black 3's $180 million. So $100 million drop. Another franchise or another example of that was, the Hellboy franchise. So Guillermo del Toro did Hellboy 1 and 2 back in the early 2000s. The first one did $59 million. The second one did $76 million. Ron Perlman was a great Hellboy. Selma Blair, a lot of good cast, good story, and Guillermo del Toro is a visionary director.
Yeah.
And now flash forward 15 years and someone goes, hey, let's make a real true to the graphic novel Hellboy that's violent and R and bloody. And we don't have the vision of Guillermo del Toro, and we don't have Ron Perlman. We've got David Harbour, who I'm not saying he's a bad actor, but I just didn't think this was, kind of the role for him. And we're going to put it out there, and we're going to get the old audience to come back and new audience. We're going to intrigue new people to come in. And that wasn't the case at all. Hellboy took in a paltry $22 million at the box office and quickly vanished as quickly as it showed up.
Yep.
So these are two examples of let's make it new that didn't work either. So,
well, one of the aspects about that is recognizing what would be new and recognizing what would be an insult to the previous audience.
Very well put.
One of the tried and true concepts that you should have in your head is that if Will Smith was in your first film and you want to make a sequel and Will Smith is not available, don't make the film. Because every franchise that Will Smith was in that he wasn't in the sequel really bombed.
Independence Day
and Men in Black. There was a sequel structure that if you had Will Smith in your first film and you want to make a second one, get Will Smith. But there's also a factor of just because it's different doesn't mean it's going to be good. And a lot of these people have gone into, well, Men in Black International, we're going to set it in Europe and make it completely new. And it really wasn't new. It was just elsewhere. A lot of these people who says, oh, I'm going to bring something new to the table. I'm going to copy from these other films that, and put it all together into a single plot, but call it this one thing. That doesn't work, but they can get the funds because it says, oh, well, if you're going to take from that movie and that movie and that movie and they all made money, then of course mine will make money. Some people with money aren't that smart, and they will pay for these things once.
We touched on it earlier, and in the same vein of talking about the ugly, intellectual properties and the age of them.
Yeah.
And I think if you don't keep intellectual property fresh in people's mind, it does, their interest wanes. But sometimes they put out films based on an intellectual property that I think is just kind of expired. I think it's past its expiration date. And two of the examples in our ugly is Shaft, which I don't know if you knew. There was a Shaft movie that came out this year.
Yes. I wanted to see it, but for some reason, I forgot.
The Shaft movie that came out this year was kind of like a reunion of the Shafts. Like they actually got all the actors who have played Shaft in this one movie. And you'd think, oh, this has to be box office gold. Nope. $21 million at the box office versus in 2000 when Samuel L. Jackson's Shaft came out, which did $70 million at the box office in 2000. Part of me is like, you can't always just sell the movie on saying, hey, Sam Jackson's in it. Now, don't get me wrong, that might sell me to go see it because I think Sam Jackson's funny.
Yep.
But obviously it didn't sell a lot of people, and most people probably at this stage in the game in 2019 probably don't know who Shaft is, one. And two, as a society and a culture, our mindset on characters like Shaft have changed. I mean, it all drums up almost like a bit of like, Dolomite.
Although that was remade in a sense.
It was. You're right. It was. Recently on Netflix with Eddie Murphy.
Yeah. And
then the other intellectual property I wanted to get to, and it's a Disney property, was we decided that after 50-something years, we were going to make a sequel to Mary Poppins.
Yeah.
So 50 years later, we make Mary Poppins Returns. Everyone loves Mary Poppins. People who watched Mary Poppins, they've got kids now. No, people who were at Mary Poppins theatrically have grandkids now, because it was 55 years ago, that they may want to take them to or may not because they don't want to go to the theaters. Mary Poppins in 1964 takes in $102 million. And Mary Poppins in 2019 takes in $66 million. Not exactly, the success that Disney had hoped for. by returning to one of its most beloved stories. But you have these two intellectual properties that, for me, I think have passed their expiration date. And a more recent example, which I'm going to use this as a cheap plug and segue into the next special episodes of the Weekend Take, Charlie's Angels tried coming back with Elizabeth Banks at the helm.
Mm-hmm.
And that movie is not faring well at the box office at all. I believe that there's many reasons why that movie is failing at the box office, but one of them, in the vein of this conversation, is it's, again, like Shaft, it's an intellectual property that's dated and is a bit sexist, and in this current landscape is not cool. I know that there's a lot of female empowerment in the film, but anybody who knows Charlie's Angels, the original, or even leading into the McG films in the early 2000s, know that it's a bit against the current, socially speaking, right now. Did these, well, now 3 particular examples, are they going to fail? Have they failed, or will they fail because the IP is past an expiration date? Do IPs have expiration?
Well, I think it's not necessarily that IPs have expiration, but there's only so much you can squeeze out of a turnip. The vibrancy of the IP will determine whether or not it can survive for decades. If it's something that had a moment in time, and that moment in time made it special, but bringing it out of that moment in time and trying to revitalize it when there wasn't much there to bring it to life to start with, that's going to be a really tough call. But there will always be people who try.
And speaking of trying it, and it's not dead yet, one of the examples of in the iffy, Rambo. So Sylvester Stallone, 76 years old now, I believe.
Not quite as old as Chuck, but...
No, not quite. But Rambo, 76 years, we're going to parade him out for Rambo 5, which it's been 11 years since the last Rambo film. And in the last Rambo film, he was already old. Now he's just older. Surprisingly did well at the box office, at least comparably to its predecessor. I mean, it's still a far cry from Rambo First Blood and First Blood Part 2 and all that.
Yeah.
But
consider that the Rambo films, every film had something different and unique within it. So they were always trying to make a little change here and there, to make it a little different, to give it a little different spin. So it wasn't remaking this first film over and over again and milking it out. They tried to make some alterations and some within the bounds of the concepts of the films. But those films in particular, each one was slightly different. It's kind of like the Alien films. Each one is slightly different. So if one missteps and doesn't make as much money, then we can make a completely different film and nobody's upset with us because the first and the second were so radically different and both good for completely different reasons. So it set up a parameter of let's make a different Alien movie and see if this one will catch fire.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.
And so looking at 2 other examples of our iffy, basically, and that was the Fallen kind of franchise at this point, which was Olympus Has Fallen, followed by London Has Fallen, and now this year Angel Has Fallen has come out.
Mm-hmm.
So in that trilogy, it's interesting because Olympus Has Fallen was the first film in the trilogy and did $98 million domestically, which was great. And then London Has Fallen comes out and it dips 33% down to $62 million at the box office, which I guess this is one of those examples of the first one was successful, so you plot out 2 and 3 already, because I would think a 33% drop like that would deter a studio from making a third film, but they did, and it was Angel Has Fallen, and Angel Has Fallen's actually performed better than London Has Fallen. So everything's about proportion. So yes, Angel Has Fallen made $68 million. What's the level of profit that you make from a film that makes $68 million based on the budget? I wouldn't consider it a home run. A home run is something like Joker is a home run, the most profitable comic book movie in history, right?
Yeah. But it's all relative. It's all relative. I happen to know that Olympus Has Fallen was actually a very low budget film, to the point where they shot it in New Orleans and borrowed casts that happened to be in New Orleans at the same time. So some of the supporting cast just happened to be there. So they said, well, we don't have to pay for travel or lodging because they're already in town making this other film. Would you come for a couple of days to be on our film? And so it was put in really cheaply. The special effects were done very specifically well, but in a manner that could be done cheaply with the way that special effects are done. So it's actually, for what it looks like on screen, it's a very cheap movie to make. That first one, bam, they make a lot of money off of it. It had a lot of the cachet of, this is not a high risk when you look at everything that was done in that first to try and make it work. And boom, it did. And it did spectacularly, a lot more money than what we anticipated making. So here's your budget for 2 and 3. If you can live within those means, and you probably can because you've already made a low budget movie. So this is the slightly higher budget movie. And then a third, to you, it seems like a big budget movie, but not to us. But we won't tell you that. And then go and run with the ball and see where it takes you. So I actually enjoyed that series of films, and am looking forward to seeing Angel Has Fallen. It came and went before I was able to see it in the theaters, but I'm definitely keeping an eye out for it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I couldn't go see Angel Has Fallen. It was here and gone too quickly. And here are these films that we're just out and out saying are not creative, are just cash grabs, and even at a loss are $150 to $200 million, or $100 to $200 million at the box office, and just seem to stick around for a while. And it's like, well, why is that?
Yeah. Well, I have often, I mean, I've actually written articles on it about the many different Hollywoods that exist. And the Olympus Has Fallen trilogy comes from a different place than the Marvel Comics universe structure of how we make money and what kind of films we make. The decision making is a different structure, but we're still making sequels. The concept of sequel exists, and there's multiple ways of fulfilling the sequel structure in an IP. And some of them can survive and thrive on that lower level of income from the public. And they make it worthwhile because not everybody has to release a 4,000 theater run on your first week to make these humongous numbers. It's a different game, but it's great that different levels of Hollywood all play this I can make money with a sequel if I do it right kind of thing. Now, their definition of doing it right differs depending on where they are in their Hollywood.
Our last example in our kind of iffy category, the Toy Story franchise. Now, I was in that gray period when Toy Story 3 came out, and that I was too old to see it. My daughter wasn't old enough to see it, so I didn't really catch Toy Story 3, but I made sure to watch it before taking her to see Toy Story 4. And then when I watched Toy Story 3, I'm like, this really doesn't need a sequel. The ending to 3 is just this really beautiful way to wrap up everything. And then Disney's like, yeah, that's great, but money's to be made. So here's Toy Story 4. Pah. And Toy Story 4 came out, and I watched it, and it added nothing. If anything, it diluted the franchise by adding this fourth film. And you're right, I wouldn't be surprised at all if down the road they made a fifth one, because
they got a formula.
They have a formula
and a date.
Toy Story 4 made $434 million. Toy Story 3 made $415 million, which seems like it's, a tick up, but when adjusted for inflation, Toy Story 3 actually made $480 million. But it's still $400 million plus per film each time they go out now. They have no reason to stop unless they grow a conscience and are like...
Wait, this is Disney we're talking about, right? That's not going to happen.
So Toy Story 4 is our last example of the iffy, because first blush, looking at the numbers, it made more than Toy Story 3, but when you adjust for inflation, it didn't. But again, this feeds into that idea of, well, profit's profit. Yeah, fine. When you adjust for inflation, yeah, we made, $40 million less, but the amount of money in our pockets didn't adjust for inflation either. So to us, it's still $434 million.
You can almost rest assured that the Disney accountant making the calculations for Toy Story is a completely different person than the Has Fallen accountant who's making the decisions for them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Went to a different accounting school.
We've talked about a number of films, but here is a really short list. And this is probably the most disturbing fact of the discussion. In 2019, there were only 4 films that outright, as sequels, made more than their predecessor. 4. We've talked about at least between 2 and 3 dozen films that could not do that. And here are 4 films that made more than their predecessor, and only 4 in 2019. And so I'll kind of run them down and we'll discuss it. So the first and obviously the largest example with reason is Avengers Endgame, taking in $858 million versus Infinity War's $678 million. The second of which is Spider-Man Far From Home, which took in $390 million versus Spider-Man Homecoming's $334 million. John Wick 3, which we talked about at the top of the show, taking in $171 million versus John Wick 2's $92 million. And not only that, but John Wick 3 at $171 million made more than John Wick 2 and 1 combined. And lastly, and it's a bit more of an obscure example, Medea Family Funeral made $73 million versus Boo 2, Medea Halloween, which made $47 million. That's a bit more of an obscure example because they weren't direct sequels of one another. They were just stories of Medea. Those are the only 4 films in 2019 as sequels or continuations of a story in Medea's case that made more than their predecessor. So what did these 4 films do differently that all the other almost 30 films we talked about previously didn't do or did wrong?
That's a good question. And I'm sure that there are studio execs in Hollywood who are scratching their heads trying to say what that answer would be. And I bet every single one of them is coming up with a different answer, if they come up with anything at all. We slightly, a bit talked about the John Wick trilogy and how it built its story and how it kind of gave a new idea. And it's one of those where every successive movie has to be bigger and badder and more violent to keep the audience it's built entertained. So far, it's been able to do that quite well with John Wick 3's return on investment. But that's one of those where you always have to top yourself in your last one will get too expensive because the kinds of things that they're putting together are going to be expensive. It's like the Fast and Furious franchise. It's gotten so expensive to make the next one that it starts to become a diminishing return. Even an accountant at Disney would start to see that it would be a diminishing return when you reach there. The Spider-Man one is an interesting one. It's the most interesting one of the 4 films you talked because it's a reboot of a continuing series. And it's a continuing series that has rebooted several times over the life of the Spider-Man genre.
And it's preparing to reboot again.
So it's like you can do 3 films of Spider-Man at a time, and then you got to reboot the franchise. And so you've got a building structure of 1, 2, 3, and then we rest, and then 1, 2, 3, and then we rest. And it's a unique way of making sequels. And the in-game being the piece de resistance, the multi, all the money goes into the in-game. As we've talked before, I completely despised the in-game movie, but I'm glad that it's over with. It made the most money because it was the last one, and anything that comes after it is kind of a restart or a refresh of the concept. But everything leading up to Endgame, especially the last 4 or 5 films, were all foretelling that the Endgame is coming. So it was kind of, you have to see it. Medea, I have never figured out why that was popular. Well, actually, know why it was popular. It's entertaining and it's fun and it's not really insulting to anybody, from what I can gather. It's not my cup of tea. I haven't watched any of the films that kind of take I'm going to make fun of my family. I'm going to make fun of family orientation and have multiple people playing, or a single person playing multiple people. I don't get off on those kinds of films, just like I don't get off on horror films. So there's certain genres that don't appeal to me, but I can definitely see why it would make a lot of money, because it's like it's friendly. It's like a cup of homemade soup. You know, it's like, yeah, this is tasty. I like this. I'm going to go back to it.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.
That sums up to today the landscape of sequels, and the fact that, like I said, 4 were successful against their predecessors, and everything else, the other, like I said, 24 films were not. There are 3 sequels left in 2019. One of them just wrapped up its opening weekend today, which was Frozen 2. So I just want to quickly look at that. So Frozen, the original, did $400 million domestically at the box office and approached $1.3 billion worldwide. Frozen 2 has a massive opening weekend, $127 million. But even with that huge number, I'm not convinced that this sequel tops the original's box office take. The second sequel of the 3 is, as I mentioned, Jumanji, The Next Level. The last Jumanji film that came out did $404 million domestically at the box office and almost $1 billion worldwide. I'm not sure Jumanji 2 matches that of Jumanji. And the last and most anticipated of these 3 sequels left in 2019 is, of course, Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, which Episode 7 did $936 million. Episode 8 did $620 million. Massive 33% drop because Episode 8, by a lot of fans, was not received well. I'm curious, will Rise of Skywalker top The Last Jedi? Is enough of the bad taste from The Last Jedi out of people's mouths by saying, well, this is going to wrap up the saga, and J.J. Abrams is back. It's not Rian Johnson anymore. And, you know, because this is supposed to wrap up the entire saga, will that bring out, you know, Star Wars fans of the original, you know, saga to see how it all ties up after 42 years of anticipation?
Yeah.
I hope that it can muster enough to beat Episode 8. I don't think it'll reach Episode 7. But yeah, looking at those 3 sequels, I mean, is Episode 9 the most likely to beat the one before it?
Well, it's going to be how they spin it. As long as they spin it like this is the Star Wars endgame, it is, you know, that will bring everybody who's seen most of the Star Wars films or some of the Star Wars films or remember what Star Wars was, they'll come and see the last one. The Frozen sequel is an interesting perspective because, you know, it's got that Disney-esque flair to it, and Frozen itself has got so many other modes of making money from franchises and marketing and theme parks, and I think that it doesn't really matter whether it tops the original, but it's got a little bit of that inherentness when I've heard the actors speak about what they've were able to achieve with the new story, that they were intrigued with not just going back to play the same old characters, but they got to inhabit them older and face different challenges, and that was intriguing to them. So it might be a completely different kind of spin on the film, and that might be enough to bring people in who may or may not have seen the first one and go, oh, this is a different kind of story. Jumanji's the one that I'm worried about. It may be just playing on the same story concepts, maybe expanding them a bit. I haven't seen enough of the sequels to know what this new story is going to be. The original Jumanji remake was unique enough that it didn't feel after the first 10 minutes that it was a remake of anything. It had a new kind of story to it. So if the same creative elements are thrown at this Jumanji 2 and keep it as fresh and unique within the same bounds of the story, it might work. But I haven't yet seen enough in the trailers they've released to know whether they sustain that or whether they fall back on their laurels. And it'll be interesting to see if that one survives and or if it drops 30% like the average of the year. But I'm gonna see it because I like some of the new characters. I'm definitely an Awkwafina fan, and I need to see what she's going to be doing in this film.
I'm certainly going to check out Star Wars Episode 9. Frozen 2, by default, being a parent, I'm going to see Frozen 2. As far as Jumanji goes, I haven't brought myself to watch Welcome to the Jungle, which was the continuation Jumanji that came out a couple years back, just because I just felt like it was blasphemy against Robin Williams' Jumanji. But it does seem like it takes an entirely different approach. It's no longer a board game; it's a video game. You know, there's a lot of different elements to it. So
they handled some interesting things about it. You should see it. You should try and catch it if you can before you see the second one.
Does the studio learn anything from the small rate of success in 2019 of sequels over their predecessors? Does studios learn anything, you think? Or do they care?
Well, to paraphrase a famous quote that nobody knows anything in Hollywood, I think that the studios never learn anything in Hollywood. The studios will not be learning as much as they could from this kind of materials, but they will also be altering their approaches to how they make films, specifically in the fact that that's what they do anyway. They are always altering slightly how they approach the concepts. So they may do it in a slightly different way. I'm not sure that they're actually learning from the results that they're getting today because they're still making money. So their motivations are different than what we see from the perspective of an audience. But the industry does change. It's constant. It's something you can count on. At least I'm counting on it. It's trying to make money myself with my own films. It's like I'm waiting for it to change so that it makes it a little easier for me to get my films done. So
it's partially our fault. And I mean our fault as a collective of the movie-going audience, because the fact that some of these movies are getting any box office dollars at all is our fault, because someone had an interest in seeing it and chose and see it. Like we could, as moviegoers, choose to see original content and new ideas, but typically that original content and those new ideas don't have the marketing dollars that these studio pictures have. And I think that's one of the big problems. If everything got onto some kind of an equal footing, which will never happen, we may stand a better chance of seeing more varied content and not having an 18-screen theater that's playing 6 movies.
When the sequels fail, that opens up a window for those short-run films to have a little bit longer run to bring more people into the theater. So we can kind of look at these sequels failures as an opening up the opportunity to see a bit more of the esoteric and art films that you and I really enjoy.
To wrap up, one last kind of foolish question, because I think I already know the answer. With such a small probability of success, like I said, 4 films in 2019, do you see this trend continuing moving forward into 2020 and further? Second part, is there a tipping point where it will just be, okay, we're only going to make a sequel if we have an actual story to continue to tell and not just as cash grabs?
I don't see them smarting up that way. I do see, because films are in the chain, we're going to have the sequelitis killing the box office for some time to come. And there will be surprises. There will be things that you didn't expect to be successes that step out and do a wonderful job. And they will become their own new sequels, or new franchises.
Chris, I want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me. And
always a pleasure.
Please be sure to check out The Weekend Take on social media. We're on Facebook at www.facebook.com/The Weekend Take. And please check out our Patreon campaign at www.patreon.com/The Weekend Take, where for as little as $1 per month, you can get exclusive extended cuts of episodes if you want to hear more of the conversation that Chris and I had today. Also, starting this season, exclusive episodes for our Patreon patrons And you also get a cool Weekend Take exclusive sticker to show us off to your friends. For now, that wraps it up this week for the Weekend Take. Again, Chris, thank you, and we'll be talking soon. And for everyone else, thank you, and good night.
Good night.
You've been listening to The Weekend Take. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes and Google Play, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.